Hi folks, welcome to our video on formative assessment for learning. And in this video, we're going to go into more detail on what formative assessment is and what it looks like. So in the last video, we did touch on these distinctions between formative and summative assessment. And we defined summative assessment as kind of the peak learning experience, that end product or end project that students hand in at the end of a unit or at the end of a cycle of learning. But there are a lot of things that we do on our way to completing that summative that we still use in order to assess where a student is in their learning. So those are going to be the formative assessments. One thing I want to address real quick is the term holistic assessment. So you'll hear this term around TKS in reference to the direction that the school is headed in. And holistic assessment is just a philosophical term that makes no distinction between formative and summative assessment when it comes to grading. So at the end of a unit or at the end of the year, the teacher has to decide what the final grade for a student is, and the teacher needs to give equal weight to both formative and summative assessment data. So let's go into a little bit more detail about how you get that formative assessment data in order to make that consideration. A couple other terms I need to deal with real quick are the words formative assessment, which is kind of the edu-speak philosophical term for assessment along the way of a unit, and the words check for understanding. So check for understanding is the tactic in the classroom that we use in order to conduct a formative assessment. And one last term I want to go over is the word data. I use the word data a lot, and when I talk about data, I'm just talking about all the information that you collect about where a student is and their understanding. So data doesn't have to be numerical. It doesn't have to necessarily be quantitative. It can be just your observations and what you see around the classroom and some qualitative notes that you have jotted down about a student and their progress. A key thing to remember for this video is that mastering formative assessment marks a shift in the concept of teaching away from the idea that teachers just teach and assess toward an idea that teachers are continually assessing and adjusting while teaching. And those are two very different approaches to the way that you conduct yourself in the classroom. So there's two basic categories of checks for understanding. One is what we call a breadth check. Breadth checks are good for giving you a general snapshot of where the class is as a whole, and it includes a large number of respondents, and they may not necessarily be accurate because breadth checks can involve a large amount of subjective self-assessment data. So for instance, if I ask students to give me a fist of 5 on how well they understand what culture is and what makes up culture, all the students in the room will show me a number of fingers. 5 being I totally understand it, I know exactly what culture is, and I can give you a whole bunch of examples. 4 being a little bit less than that, all the way down to 1 being I struggle with the concept, maybe I don't even know the definition. So when I ask my classroom to give me a fist of 5, I'm getting a lot of subjective data from that. I can see everybody at once in the classroom giving me a number, and that can kind of give me just a general snapshot of where the class is, but it doesn't actually tell me where any particular student individually is in their understanding. It also doesn't tell me whether or not students are conducting an honest and accurate self-evaluation. The other type of check for understanding is a depth check. So a depth check will allow me to drill down and discover exactly how deep knowledge or understanding really goes in a particular student. It's more individualized and it's more specific, and therefore it's less generalizable to the class. When I ask a question like, how does Parvana in the book Parvana's Journey demonstrate her relationship with her culture? And then I'll call on Isabella to answer that question. And Isabella will respond, and I'll dig a little bit deeper and keep asking her, well, why do you think that? Why do you say that? And I will sit there and have a little mini conversation with Isabella to find out how deep her individual understanding really goes. To give you some more examples of breadth checks, cold calling can be a breadth check sometimes. I gave you that illustration of cold calling in the context of a depth check because I kept drilling Isabella further and further on why she was saying the things that she was saying. But I can also use cold calling as a breadth check if I call on a whole lot of people very quickly. If I'm in a math class and I say, what's 7 times 6? Ahmed. What's 4 times 3? Abdul. What's 5 times 7? Nabiha. What's 8 times 8? Aisha. In that case, I'm getting responses back, and I can quickly evaluate whether or not those responses are accurate, but it doesn't give me an accurate picture of how deep their understanding goes or how they're coming about to that conclusion. We've already gone over the fist of 5, and the thumbs up or down is just another variation of that. Whiteboards are a great way to get a quick breadth check. If you've got every student in the room that has a whiteboard and they can write down quick answers on the whiteboard, that's great. Four corners is a great activity because you can ask students to shuffle around to the different corners of the room that correspond with certain answers to things. I can have corners of the room correspond to specific answers that I make available to students, kind of like a multiple choice. One corner is A, another corner is B, another corner is C, and another corner is D. And then I can ask a question and ask students to move into the corner that has the response that they agree with. And generally, I would follow that up with some cold calling as well to find out why students are in the corner that they chose. And lastly, I can use a survey. Any type of survey will do. Google creates good surveys. Any type of survey strategy or survey technique acts as a good breadth check. Because the goal of a depth check is to drill down and see how far understanding goes, it really has to be targeted and a little bit more focused on single students. That's why cold calling alone isn't necessarily a depth check. You also have to drill in a little bit on that student and ask, why are you saying what you're saying? Targeted questions really helpful also. You can get into kind of deeper level questions and find out if students have really considered those questions or not. Circulating to check work is also another type of depth check. If you have students writing a paragraph response on a particular prompt or issue, walking around the room and reading what they're writing as they're actively doing it, quizzing them about why they're writing certain things or why they're saying certain things is a great way to challenge students in their thinking. No opt-out is a good activity also. In no opt-out, you have all the students in the room stand up, and then you ask students a question, and they are only allowed to sit down after they have answered the question to an acceptable standard for you. So what this does is when you make students stand up, their natural instinct is to want to sit down. They don't like standing up, they feel exposed, and they feel vulnerable. So you're more likely to get students that are ready to get the questioning over with and are willing to accommodate you with the depth of response that you're looking for so that they can earn the right to sit down. And you do that with each individual student in the classroom until they're all seated. And lastly is an exit ticket. For an exit ticket, you just make a rule that students are not allowed to leave the room until they have adequately responded to a prompt. And then as students hand you those responses, you can read them afterwards in your own time and evaluate at what level students are demonstrating understanding. Now that we've looked at some examples of checks for understanding, I just want to go over a couple principles at work when you see these checks for understanding. The first is that CFUs is part of a holistic approach. So as you're doing checks for understanding in the classroom, you are building up your ability to assess exactly where every student in your class is and what skill level they're at. Another principle is that checks for understanding are included in lesson plan. So when you're writing your lesson plan, you need to schedule out your checks for understanding. And you need to schedule checks for understanding for both content and instructions. There are times in which you will give students multiple step instructions. You'll say, okay, next in class you need to complete this document, and then once the document is completed, you'll go partner up with somebody else, and then you guys will use this other checklist. Anytime you have instructions that have multiple steps in them, you should do a check for understanding on those instructions to make sure that all students understand the instructions before you say go, and students get to work on that. That will just reduce a lot of misunderstanding and kind of chaos in your classroom. And of course, checks for understanding should also be spontaneous. Yes, they should be planned in your lesson, but they should also be spontaneous. Anytime you see an opportunity to do a check for understanding in the classroom, do one. Checks for understanding aren't just for you building your understanding of where students are. It also helps cement in students' minds what exactly they know. Other principles at work in CFUs include balance of speaking time. So one of the things that you want to be conscious of is how many minutes you're speaking over the course of a class versus how many minutes students are speaking or communicating. Students are communicating either orally or in written form, and if you added all of the total minutes in which a student is communicating in your classroom, how many minutes are they communicating? It's important to strike a good balance of you talking versus students talking. And good checks for understanding can be used as a way to leverage that and make sure that students are communicating and speaking a little bit more often in your classroom. Checks for understanding build relationships. It matters to students how much you know about them and how much you understand their needs. The more you do checks for understanding and you come to understand where a student is in their learning journey, the closer that student is going to feel to you. It increases the number of interactions that you and the student have, and so that helps build the relationship as well. And lastly, checks for understanding help keep the class moving together. So it's really hard to teach 22 individuals, but it's really easy to teach one class. And doing checks for understanding on a regular basis in your classroom and only moving the whole class forward when everybody in the class understands is a great way to keep the class together and make them accountable not just to you, but to each other for the knowledge and understanding of the subject matter. A good key takeaway for understanding formative assessment is that good formative assessment is ongoing and active. So it requires you to be active in the classroom. You need to constantly be circulating and interacting and guiding and responding while gathering data about your students and where they individually are in their learning journeys. It means that very rarely will you see the teacher just sitting at the front while students are working in their desks. That's all I've got about checks for understanding. I'm going to attach one more video to this and just watch it being mindful of these concepts and ideas, and then we'll do some activities in the classroom to reinforce these ideas.